the entire world is talking about what happens after 2015. What should the development look like? There's also greater consensus that development, the pathway has to be different to what we have been on so far. The main reason for this, as you all know, is because we are facing a very severe environmental challenge. Development has come as the cost of the environment, and it is now no longer possible to think that we can have unlimited growth. Also, the issues have been that in this development pathway, although we have made progress in terms of reducing poverty, reducing things like child mortality, maternal deaths, we are still dealing with lots of people who still remain poor. 47% of them, who the World Bank says lives in South Asia. So for South Asia, the challenge is immense. We have to have better growth, we have to have better equality, and we have to protect our natural resources. Hence, the need to think differently about development, I think, is paramount. And this is the main reason that CEPA is also interested in this topic, and interested in this topic from a South Asia perspective, because we feel that there is a lot the region needs to do to engage with this agenda, that it should also be something that the region can set and that they can set their own priorities. Hence, since the world is talking about the next set of goals, it actually gives us a good opportunity to also engage with it and also present those ideas in those forums. And right now, the forums are quite heavily led by the global north, as they're called, and there is a need to bring in a lot more perspective from the global south. Hence, today's meeting, the next 2 days, what we are aiming for is that we talk about some critical issues for South Asia, issues that we would like to be taken up in terms of larger development goals. And the reason that we are partnering with the Center for Policy Dialogue, the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Center for Policy Dialogue is from Bangladesh. The Sustainable Development Policy Institute is from Pakistan. Practical Action Sri Lanka and the South Asia Policy and Research Institute from Sri Lanka is because all these institutions are interested in this topic, are involved in different forums that are taking this message forward. Especially the Southern Voice Initiative and the Club de Madrid actually have a presence in the high-level panel discussions. There are also others of you here from TWN, from Badanatu Todo, and I'm sure ODI and different places also who actually have links and have been dealing with the global discussions. So we hope that the engagements here will be taken forward by you to these different forums. CEPA is also involved in the People's Forum, which is a part of the CHOGM, which takes place next week, which is also talking about MDGs and what are the Commonwealth's issues for the MDGs. And we will be feeding this information into the sessions there as well. I'd also like to just mention the supporters of this event, IDRC's Think Tank Initiative, the Swiss Development Corporation, Dialogue, and YA TV, who have extended their support to make this event possible. The sessions are structured so that there are, obviously we can't address all the issues that are necessary. So we have picked 4 issues that have come up in the global debates as being very important. And they are also ones that are heavily debated. So it's on that basis that the topics have been chosen. And they are in your agendas, and you can download more information on the topics from our website. And the way it will be structured is that the sessions will have position papers and presenters. Position papers meaning overall content into the topic. Presenters will then stimulate the discussion by giving us a couple of things to think about. The discussants will respond to that, and then we would like it to open it out to the larger forum. The reason this year is a much smaller group, and this is different to how CEPA normally does its symposiums, because we do try to get as many people as possible to come. The reason it is restricted this year is because we really want you to have a dynamic conversation and really engage with the topics and have a really good discussion. So we have also tried very hard to leave as much time as possible for discussions. And we really hope that you will engage and also enjoy the sessions. A couple of housekeeping issues before we move on. The sessions are being streamed, and because of that, we really request that you use your mics, because if you don't, then the streaming has no sound. And when you're done with your mic, do we need to switch them off? Yes? Keep them on all the time? Okay. So you don't need to switch it off, so keep it on, but please do talk into the mic. In the interest of trying as much as possible to reduce our footprint, we have not printed everything. It's all on your sticks, and it's all also on our website. We will have Wi-Fi eventually in this room, hopefully in a little while, and you can get on and check your get online and actually download the presentations. So let me invite Dr. Indrajith Coomaraswamy, who is going to chair the first session. He is on the board of director of both CEPA and SAPRI, and I believe many other companies and organizations. He's also a former director of the Commonwealth Secretariat. He will lead the first session on demystifying MDGs and setting the context. And as the name suggests, it's really about trying to give the symposium the overall context. Why are we doing this? What are the issues in the larger discussions? And setting the stage for our discussions of the next 2 days. Let me also invite Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya, Dr. Shehryar Toru Khan, Bhathiya Kekulanda, and Priyanthi Fernando to also come up and be a part of the first session. So hopefully you will have interesting and dynamic discussions, and it's fine to have different views. That is exactly what we want, so that you can thrash it out. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to particularly welcome those of you who've come from abroad, and welcome to all of you. I think my responsibility in this session is to make some preliminary remarks to set the stage. Now, Karin has done such an excellent job that I'm going to take a slightly different tack in terms of contributing to giving some background to this symposium. And what I thought I would do was really to look back at the genesis of the MDGs with a view to considering whether we can learn some lessons, whether some of the things that slipped off the development framework at that time need to be addressed this time around as we look for a framework for the post-2015 era. Now, as you all know, the MDGs have enjoyed sustained support of government, civil society, the development community in general, for the last decade. And as Karin said, we've had commendable progress on a number of fronts, though there are significant disparities both within and across countries. Now, as you also know, the MDGs emerged as a practical and measurable articulation of the Millennium Declaration, which was adopted by the high-level segment of the UNGA, that's the heads of government segment of the UNGA in 2000. And in terms of going back to the genesis of the MDGs, it's instructive to consider the global landscape as it was in the lead up to the Millennium Declaration. And you will recall that the Asian crisis had just taken place in 1997-98. The contagion effects had spread to other emerging markets around the world, and even the markets of developed countries were under threat at one point. Now, at that time, there was a kind of emerging sentiment that one needed a reform of the global economic governance arrangements, reform of the international financial architecture. There was a sentiment that emerged at that time. But the world economy recovered very quickly, and the enthusiasm for systemic reform waned equally quickly, particularly among those powerful countries who had a vested interest in the status quo. So when, in that context, when the developed world first advanced the MDGs, it was very tempting to consider it as a bit of a red herring, to divert attention from the systemic reforms that were necessary to give the global south a greater voice in terms of global economic governance, the international financial architecture, etc. Furthermore, primarily by focusing on the social pillar of development, one clearly had an imbalance in terms of the three pillars that underpin development. So a more holistic approach, which adopted a more balanced approach across the economic, social, and environmental pillars, would clearly have been preferable. One could argue, therefore, that the MDGs were a suboptimal outcome, that they were a necessary but not sufficient condition for a framework for development. So this raises the question as to why they became so widely accepted. And there, I think one should recall an effective parallel narrative that was around at that time, which was used to justify the framework that was eventually adopted for the MDGs. Because, at the end of the Cold War, which is usually marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there was a lot of optimism that there would be a peace dividend, and that part of the peace dividend would be diverted to deliver a development dividend as well, that there would be significant increases in ODA flows. However, what transpired in the 1990s was actually a significant decline in ODA. There was a peace dividend, but the peace dividend was used by the donor countries, one, to put their own finances in order, and two, to support transformation in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So what really happened was that ODA fell. So by the time you got to the dawn of the new millennium, there was considerable donor fatigue. And there was this very negative narrative in the Western media about corruption, mismanagement in the developing world, particularly in Africa. So the MDGs really was seen as a framework that would help to win over the hearts and minds of taxpayers in these countries, in the donor countries. So that was, in a way, the justification that was given for what was significantly, which was largely a more limited agenda than would have been ideal. So you had this focus essentially on things like, extreme poverty, maternal mortality, girls' education, etc., which were issues that the Western, the donor country taxpayers could relate to and support. So you saw upturn in ODA, buy into the MDG process, and we've gone through 10 years. Now, of course, now there's been a reduction in ODA because of the global financial crisis, but that has been more than made up for by the rise of China, the impact on commodity prices because of that, Chinese investment in infrastructure. India, though much less significant, has also become a new donor. So really, you've had this support coming through. On balance, I think one could conclude that the MDG framework did get significant amount of mileage, though partial. So now what we need to ask ourselves is, what do we need to focus upon as we go forward? Do we need a more holistic approach to the economic and environmental pillars? Do they need to be integrated more centrally into the new framework? What about the systemic issues which slipped off the table? Do we need attention to the international financial architecture? What about the international trading system? Is it as development friendly as it should be? The Doha round, which was launched on the premise of development friendly outcomes, has got stuck. The global negotiations on a climate convention are stuck. There's a high priority that needs to be attached to financing and technology transfer in that framework. That is not really moving forward. So given all this, what should be the framework? And I hope over the next 2 days, we will be able to address some of these issues. Now, that's by way of introduction. We have with us an extremely eminent group of speakers who will address this kind of setting the context remit that has been given for this session. And we will start with Dr. Bhattacharya, who is chair of the Southern Voice Initiative and distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue. And his topic is going to be current debates and activities in the MDG, SDG global discussion. Now, I think if one is to talk of Southern Voices, I think Dr. Bhattacharya's name is really synonymous with that. He's been a leading proponent of the positions of the Global South on this subject and on other subjects. He has tremendous experience across a range of development issues, so it's a great pleasure for us to have Dr. Bhattacharya to address us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Can I start by taking off my jacket?
Of course. I can't deny you what I've treated myself to.
Thank you, Chair, for that very kind and very illuminating introduction. Good morning, colleagues. Let me first express my deep satisfaction for being here today. And I take this opportunity to congratulate CEPA under the leadership of Priyanthi and the great work done by Karin in bringing us all over here. And I, as an institutional person, I know how much time and energy and creativity it takes to organize a session like this. And CEPA had been always trying to be different from many others mainstream thinkers. So in that sense, they have put in, a lot of innovation in designing the two-day meeting. It's all. I also like to compliment CEPA also as a part of our South Asian fraternity and also as a member of the Southern Voice on post-MDG International Development Goals. I'm very pleased to be here, and I feel honored to make this curtain-raising presentation, which is a very wide canvas thing, and I don't think everybody will find everything there. And definitely, I try to be less provocative here and try to be more, more positive in the sense that they give some of the informations and let the House debate the issues as we go. And as I approach the presentation, I am remembering now how many more issues I have left out. But let me see whatever I have over here at this moment. I think the introduction from Dr. Coomaraswamy was very, very helpful. It gave us the political context, the economic circumstances, and the discussions which were really dominating the development discourse in the end of 1990s, and how the MDGs have come about. I think the word used, it was necessary but not sufficient. It avoided the systemic issues, but at the same time tried to keep up the energy of the taxpayers, donors, and the taxpayers. Now, if you look back, then there had been another distinguishing feature of the MDG formulation. It was produced in a political vacuum. There was no consultation. It was a top-down approach. Basically, the Secretariat has worked with certain member states, and then it was approved. So, in contrast, this time around, you will see that a lot of discussions are taking place around the world. There are a lot of streams of discussions which are taking place, and they have progressed over the last year and a half. And we are approaching now at a critical juncture in many ways. The large part of the discussion had been done under the auspices of the United Nations, but individual organizations and definitely the non-government stream, including the private sector, had been quite active in this ways. But theoretically, the leadership is provided by the UN and its Secretary General. But if you look at the context, the way the MDG is currently being produced, there are two different processes which are trying to become, are being brought together. The one process which comes from the 2000 summit, MDG summit, when it was produced, and thereafter in 2010, when the summit took place to review the outcomes and the future, and then and it thought of having an MDG Mark II, phase 2, given its success and the unfinished agenda and everything together. On the other hand, there is a second process which has come out, which is definitely the Rio Plus 20 conference, which created the open working groups. I'll talk about that later. And now these two processes are supposed to merge, and they are supposed to merge and create the sustainable development goals in ways. These two processes are, at some points they're cooperating, at some point they're contesting each other. So it will be very, very interesting to see how two different international processes under the same institutions come and merge and produce an unanimous set of consensus set of goals. Now the current stream of works, as I say, I mentioned here only three of the major streams of work. One which comes with the UN task system, task force, that the task team is essentially is the nodal organization of the various UN system and system agencies and others. And they have produced a report, which was also the report was also based on some of the surveys which went on, My World Survey and others, and realizing the future we want for all. In the report was produced first in June 2012. See, it was one of the first reports which came out in many ways. You have heard about this much vaunted high-level panel, which was co-chaired by the Indonesian president, the Liberian president, and the Prime Minister of UK. One could have thought that not a very, quite an unusual choice on the part of the OECD countries to be a co-chair. But this got a lot of political traction, and finally this year in May they have brought out the report, A New Global Partnership, which was, as you know, was the lead author was Homi Karas, and many others colleagues were involved. And so this report is essentially one of the must-read type of thing which goes around and nowadays. Then we, apart from these high-level panels, you may know that there had been other outputs which are related to the post-MDG framework. One important one is the, which I don't mention here, but I will refer to the reports later, is the SDNS, the Sustainable Development Network Solution, which is led by, SDNS is led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and they have also come out with one report. Then there is another report which is also a very interesting one, and I will strongly recommend that you may take a glimpse at it, is the private sector's report on Global Compact and how over there, and they have interesting ideas from private sector partnership. Apart from these, there are also various types of NGO reports, and also the regional recommendations synthesized by the NGLS, the Non-Government Liaison Office of the UN system. So those are very interesting things as well. Number of blogs are in operation, and also there are other the discussions or reports, contributions coming from specific areas, for example, for education, for health, for physically challenged people, for the excluded ones, and etc. And now then we have the, apart from these inputs coming in, then there, the debate had been always that whether what is the legal status of these inputs, how do they relate to the intergovernmental process. Now the member states have made it clear these are only for consideration and only inputs given to the Secretary General, and the Secretary General, as deems fit, will absorb them or recycle them as appropriate, as he has done in the last UN General Assembly meetings in his report, and will be coming through in 2014. And the intergovernmental process takes up beyond these, which is the which they think is has the legal status or the jurisdiction in that way, mandate to negotiate, is the Open Working Group, is a quasi-negotiating body in some ways. Open Working Groups were created in the post, as you may know, in Rio Plus 20, and the Open Working Groups had been in session throughout this year, and they are possibly ending in March. the next meeting, which is in November, in the third week of November, they will be discussing the macroeconomic issues, investment finance, etc. And in December, before Christmas, there is the last, this year's last meeting, which is on the issues related to countries with special needs, including least developed country, SIDs, fragile states, and the countries in conflict, and etc. So open working group is some way the connection between the non-governmental processes or the consultative processes and the intergovernmental discussion which we have. Now in September we had an important meeting of the UNGA, and the results of that is that this will give you the time frame within which we will be operating, that the intergovernmental negotiation will be launched in 2014 in September. So before that we are going to conclude the outcomes of the intergovernmental negotiations through the open working group. They will come out with a report before that, and then we will, the SG will give the summary of all the negotiations in 2015, and in 2015 we are going to have a head of government meeting which will declare the new framework, whatever that means at this point in time. So you now know that we still have almost 2 years to go for this discussion. If you and if you look at the discussion, one of the critical points I wanted to mention is that this discussion didn't have, although it was a widely consultative process, still didn't have the voice of the South or the developing countries in many ways. I mentioned here 4 major reasons why the voice of the South was not very heard in this case. The first point was the participation shortfall. If you look at the participation shortfall, I mean from the developing countries, because the amount of energy and technical expertise it necessitates in order to be plugged into the system, that is definitely not available within the developing countries. That is a mission in New York with 6 people cannot really cope up with all these things, what is happening around in that city at the same time. If you look at even one country, and I'm sure my colleagues are here from UK, they will vouch it for me, that how much resources the UK government, given its leadership role in the high-level panel, have invested in terms of putting in money, human resource, and other technical capacities in getting those things. In comparison, I think all the southern countries together didn't have that much at their disposal. So the second point was also capacity deficit, because those people who are negotiating over there are basically diplomats, and they did not necessarily have all the technical expertise and were not necessarily also plugged into the home country resources like yourselves and others in different countries. So there was a significant capacity deficit. Thirdly, I contend that there were knowledge asymmetry, and this knowledge asymmetry obviously reflected in the quality of work. And finally, the power imbalance, which is always there, underpins the knowledge asymmetry. So these are some of the issues which were there. This is if the PowerPoint is circulated, you will know that the process discussion has completed. The content generation is currently going on, and we are now approaching the negotiation and the debate phase at this moment. Now, I have been shown that I have 5 minutes left, but I have just got to the framework issues over here. Now, the framework issue, the first point is that will be the emphasis? Will the emphasis be on finishing of the job, that is the unfinished agenda, or it is the add-on, the next agenda? So which one? The balance between new issues and the finishing the agenda, the MDG agenda, has been one of the critical points where we don't have any consensus as yet. And there are also prioritization of the issues in that way, what has been called getting to zero, that you do zero imbalances over there in certain areas. So whether we will get some prioritization over there. As you may know, in MDG there was no prioritization as such. In the future, whether we go into that. The architecture is always being a matter of discussion. I put before you, these are the 2 slides. This is a comparative slide of the 3 reports of the HLP, the SDNS report, and the Global Compact report. And you will see that how do they define sustainable development. Now, if you look at the HLP report, they have taken the traditional path of defining the 3 pillars of sustainable development: the social dimension, economic dimension, and environmental. The interesting part of the SDNS report is that apart from this, besides these three, they have added a new pillar. That is the good governance. This will be interesting to see whether this House really thinks it is time that we move from the three pillars of the sustainable development to the fourth pillar. That is the governance pillar, which might be, anybody may consider also a cross-cutting pillar. But whether there is any value in having that pillar separately over there. Yeah, if you look at the Global Compact report, their definition of sustainable development is totally different. They put in the poverty aspects, the poverty issues, and how they have a pyramid over there. If you go to the report, they will find that. And then the human needs and capacities, and then the resource triad. And resource triad is the energy and climate, water and sanitation, agriculture and food, and the enabling environment. This is close. Enabling environment comes close to the governance issues possibly, but more than that. Here, the enabling issues environment is both the national, regional, and the global in many ways. Now, the challenge is how the idea of sustainable development with all its pillars are going to balance out itself. Currently, the debate is that whether the Rio Plus 20 group is going to hijack it from which are essentially the environmental-oriented organizations and people, hijack the whole MDG agenda from the development group as it goes. And this is an issue which is going on. Both sides have their own merits and demerits. I'll be very interested to know how this House looks at that development versus environment, or to put it more crudely, growth, inclusive growth versus environment issues, how this House will go about. Now, there are the comparison. I lost it.
Can we have some help?
Yes, I have it.
Got it, okay.
This is, if you see the comparative analysis of the goals and targets of the three major reports, the HLP, SDNS, and the Global Compact, you see all of them have been very, very, very circumspect in terms of, or very restrained in terms of giving out the number of goals. 10 to 12, that is the average number, because it was 8 out there. So people think that you cannot go too far. And the targets are 30, and none of them went for giving the indicators as yet. So it is, and you will see, if you see, the green ones are usually the totally overlapping goals. The yellow ones are these marginally overlapping, but with different emphasis. And you will see the red ones, these are where there are no targets separately from others. Look at that. HLP says create jobs, sustainable livelihoods, and equitable growth. No separate goals on SDNS, but it mentions youth unemployment. I'm just taking an example. But the Global Compact doesn't consider it as a separate goal, thinks it will be a total outcome of their sustainable development issues. Or natural resources, Global Compact, no separate goals, targets, but they bring in under the triad. You know, I mentioned water, air, and land in that way. Ensure peaceful society had been a major area of debate, post-conflict countries and other issues. SDNS doesn't put it over there, but others have got there. Let me move on. The second major challenge which is there, which is the fight between, also the tension between the universalists and the developmentalists, if I may call them in a crude way. You see, the universalists are talking about the global agenda. And so you have a sustainable universal framework. But this whole origin of MDGs had been recognition of the uneven level of development of different countries. So how do you really, and which will mean they will have different needs and different priorities. How do you accommodate the national priorities and the special needs of developing countries within an universal framework, and whether that universal framework will have adequate integrity in the area of environment. So you may, whether the question is whether you're going to have a lose-lose situation, which means you give away the specific focus on development, but you do not really win as much you should have on the environment agenda, particularly on climate issues and other sustainable consumption structure. That concern is very much out there at this moment. Poverty agenda, everybody agrees. This is one area where everybody is in full compliance or consensus that we need to that. On the inequality issue, there is obviously no, at this moment, no agreement, because everybody understands income inequality is not good enough. There is multidimensionality of inequalities, everybody accepts. Everybody understands the access issue is important. But how do you really reflect which dimension of inequality in this particular way? Will it be done in the universal framework, or it should be taken up at the country level? Inclusive growth. MDG never had the growth issue, but we now know through research that it is very difficult to have sustainable improvement in health and education without an inclusive growth agenda in that way. But how that will be defined, that is a different issue. But we should all remember, MDG never had a macroeconomic framework. Some considered it to be its weakness. Some considered it to be an advantage as a flexibility. So this is something where it would be there. Gainful employment is also another area where it should be exclusively targeted because MDG's targets were not good enough. The major criticism coming from the developing countries is that the lack of emphasis on productive capacity building. Without structural transformation of the economies, all these progresses will not remain sustainable and predictable and also in that sense inclusive. Because people need to have income, people need to have decent jobs, and that has to be predictable and sustainable in many ways. So this is an issue which is there, and the structural transformation on productive capacity has a broader connotation. It means growth of modern agriculture. It doesn't mean only industry of course, and high value services and infrastructure in that way. Financing options. I won't go into details. We can discuss it in the course of the next 2 days. But there are two major consensus now coming around on the financing options. The first option is that, yes, ODA is important. Keep the promises of 0.7% of the GNI of the OECD countries, but it is not enough. That consensus is coming through. I think it is also being partly accepted by the developing countries. The second point which is coming through, the second consensus, finance is not enough. It is the instruments of implementation cannot be only finance. It has to also deal with the rules and regulations of global governance. It has to do, the mention had been made, it has been mentioned that we need to have a more development-friendly trade rules. And given the Doha round stalling with the Bali meeting coming, that is also an issue. The issue is, of course, the financial architecture. The issue is, of course, climate negotiation. The issue is also about intellectual property right regime, whether this one is really creating the balance between the innovators and the consumers. So IPR regimes, trade, investment, and all these issues have to come together in some way or another. And so ODA is important, but not enough, so we have to go into domestic resource mobilization and many others. The second, finance is important, but not enough, so we will have to go into other means of implementation. From aid to sustainable growth and public goods, that is the other areas. Global partnership, it is now being said that it is not only the ODA issue which has to be there, but along with the ODAs, we are talking about South-South cooperation, the new elements coming in. Along with that, we are talking about parliamentarians, private sector, non-government organization to be involved in the implementation and delivery of it. How we are going to integrate all these multi-stakeholders into a country-to-country or an intergovernmental structure within which is an issue which is to be seen. One word which is becoming very, very popular, please remember it, it is called data revolution. I don't know how much revolution we can do there, but it is the issue of reforming or strengthening that information base. From the southern perspective, data is not only necessary for monitoring or delivering things, it is an instrument for transparency and accountability. For us, it is an instrument of accountability and transparency, so we are giving a lot of emphasis on these issues. I can discuss what we are going to do in the coming days in them. Governance is an issue because governance, there is a strong view that the corruption, or the bureaucratic deficit, the governance deficit is impacting on the sustainability of the outcome. But what do we mean by governance? There is obviously no consensus, because some of us, the developed countries, think governance means what is happening in the country. Many of us in the South, we think governance should include also the governance structure of the international organizations, including IMF, World Bank, and UN included. So the last point is that where shall we emphasize on? In the MDG, the major emphasis was on inputs and quite often on outputs, but we have understood in the process access is important, and more importantly, outcome is important. We can send all our children to school. They may also graduate, but they may not be able to have marketable skills. So the quality of education is important, so outcome is important. I think that is a new realization which is coming. So the coming months are very important, and so we are having this meeting. I think the intergovernmental process is entering into a new phase, the important phase. And the issue is, the challenge for us, at least from the Southern Voice perspective, how we are going to keep the voice alive when the intergovernmental process takes over the negotiations and outcome. Because till now, it was our time. We were discussing, we are being consulted, and etc. Now the whole thing will get into the negotiating room in New York with all the member states, and also particularly some equal among the more equal than the others. And finally, when the document comes up, will there be any scope for us to react to that, for any revisions on that? So it will all depend on us, how much prepared we will be when it really comes out and in the coming months. So I hope this discussion will contribute to finding a way out for that. Thank you very much for the indulgence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya. That's a wonderful launch to our deliberations. It was an extraordinarily comprehensive and substantive presentation of great clarity. I think that's extremely helpful. Now, the marching orders that Karin has given me is that at this point I should entertain a few points of clarification, just points of clarification. But we're a bit behind schedule, so I hope at the end, exactly. So I hope you will permit me. Yeah, if that's okay.
I have eaten up my own time, so I cannot complain.
So we'll leave that to the Q&A session at the end. Now, next we have Dr. Shehryar Toru Khan, with an associate fellow for Sustainable Development associate fellow from the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Pakistan, and his theme is going to be Emerging Development Challenges for South Asia in a post-2015 Sustainable Development Framework. Dr. Khan leads several, I think you've got brief CVs in your packages on your stick, so I'm not going to go into any detail, but Dr. Khan does lead on a number of streams of work at SDPI. So Dr. Khan.
Is it talking? Will it come on? Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for, I would like to thank CEPA for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to present, can you all hear me? Giving me an opportunity to present my views. Of late, I've been thinking a lot about, as to what are the real problems in Pakistan, and obviously then that problems leads to a much larger problems in South Asia, and it's already pointed out by in this preliminary discussion that it is very difficult to actually pin down. It is very difficult to actually find out, what are we really dealing with in terms of sustainable development, in terms of the so many agendas of issues that are concerns our states in South Asia. So before I initiate my initial thoughts, what really comes to my mind is two important issues. Number one is what are the rising concerns to human development in South Asia, and secondly, development problems and recent development thinking. So we need to really look at these first two issues, from a very comprehensive and in a focused way, before we can actually lay down some any framework of trying to build consensus here, or trying to come up with some kind of solutions. And so the first 2 points would lead to, hopefully would lead to the third one, which would be the post-development agenda. So if you look at the state of governance, to me, and as I was, I've been involved in projects which concerns a lot of institutions in Pakistan, and also concerns, the problems of governance in Pakistan. I see that there's a major governance problem in South Asia. If you look at the majority of South Asians live under poor social and economic conditions, which is captured by many development reports, and as you have already come across, and most of you are already working on some of the projects which directly look at these kind of issues of poverty, education, illiteracy, growth, and all that. And particularly the less privileged, and the women are vulnerable to demographic and insecure conditions. To cite the Human Development Report on South Asia, recent South Asia, 400 million illiterate adults, and out of 400 million, 250 are women. 1 billion people are without access to improved sanitation services, and more than 160 million are without access to drinking water. Now, I've put this deliberately. I've put these statistics deliberately. As we are talking about post-development goals and framework, I ask a question, Now, what happens to these figures? So where are we now? Have we ever asked ourselves, or have we ever thought about what has gone wrong in the state and economy, and what we have been doing when we look at these figures here? And I may sound a bit pessimistic, but at least unless we lay down some concrete suggestions here, I think that situation is not going to improve. There are many children I keep referring to the context of Pakistan, because similar issues in India and similar issues in Bangladesh and similar issues in Sri Lanka, that there are children without access to water, there are children not going to schools, there are issues of access, and all these problems are still there. So have we ever really thought about, as to, what are the real issues here? What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with some kind of economic growth? Are we dealing with sustainability? And and frankly speaking, it really confuses me how to bring about this sustainability from the point of view, if you look at it from the World Bank perspectives, because they really describe these governance issues in a more sort of abstract level by trying to analyze the developing countries or the South Asian countries with some kind of a framework which look at these idealistic kind of society. Well, we do not have that kind of societies here. We are talking about people in extreme poverty. We are talking about people who have lost on economic growth. But maybe all these policies are fine in terms of laying down a framework, in terms of telling the people, in terms of making the, letting us know that here we are. But when we come to state-specific and institutions and the country-level analysis, the situation is still bleak, and I hope it gets better. So, if I look at it as a governance as a fundamental development challenge in South Asia, primarily, but when I say this, I ask a question, why the states in South Asia have failed to implement policies conducive to sustainable development. So why have we failed? What are the reasons for we keep talking about these growth and targets, MDGs and development goals, but what are the real reasons of not achieving them? Or maybe some countries are close to achieving some of the Millennium Development Goals, but by and large we are far off from Millennium Development Goals. And I look at it that our institutions are over politicized. Clientelistic forms of political and social behavior, weak accountability and institutionalized corruption, continuous decline or the weakening of state institutions, and finally, all these points have implications for sustainable development here. So I think that when we talk about any framework for development, or when we talk about implications of sustainable development on governance and governance, etc., I think we need to look at the way our institutions perform. Are we looking at the problems of governance from organizational perspective? Are we looking at in terms of capacity of improving state capacity? I think that we have not really addressed the core issue, which is looking at the deep structures, which is looking at the problems of governance in our country, and what kind of institutions do we have, and how do we improve the lives of the people, particularly when the state represents the elites, and they do not really pay attention to the people, to the common man, because if you have a kind of a political structure which creates rents, and by creating rents they attempt to solidify their own power, and by this they are unable to let the power distribute across the society. So it is a very basic problem here. I think that the state of the institutions are the primary institutions upon which rests the agenda of development. Now, it is fine to talk about the growth and etc., but it is always the states, and I think that the states cannot be removed. The states cannot be, all the NGOs are doing a lot of work here and trying to, make the states aware that, here are the problems. But really, in a sense, when we talk about the supply side and the demand side, they both need to be equated. They both need to be talking to each other. So on one hand, we have the state organizations, the institutions problem here, and on the other hand, a lot of NGOs in Pakistan and Sustainable Development Policy Institute, for example, are working with the communities, or some of the Poverty Analysis Center in across South Asia are working with the communities. But the real problem is that all these reforms have not been really institutionalized. So if you look at it from sort of an abstract level, we need to build our framework around reconceptualizing governance, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Devesh there, that how do you define governance? So governance is it the governance by judging at the institutions with reference to some modern states? Well, we need to reconceptualize this framework. We need to look at governance by analyzing the deep structures. Now, I'm deliberately using these words from an abstract level because I would require a lot of time, but we need to look at governance from a non-normative perspective. Governance is not simply about, it is about accountability, it is about corruption, it is about all that, but it has been analyzed as an idealistic form of government. We need to look at governance from the perspective of the everyday state, what we have, the institutions, the way our organizations perform, the way we perform business. So is it going to be the governance based on the realities of the people? Is it going to be the governance which reflects the true understanding of how the states and the organizations perform in South Asian states? Unless we look at the governance from deep structures perspective, which actually provides the context of exploring the gap between the institutions and which effectively shape the society and the formal organizations. So I think that the foremost point is that governance is a huge challenge to South Asian countries. And secondly, any reform agenda has to look at the governance from the deep structures perspective. And by which I mean that this is the time that we need to look at the quality of our state, the quality of our institutions. And or is it going to be business as usual? Because what we have been doing so far is that I have been personally involved. I can give you a few examples here. I have been personally involved in capacity development measures, and I have seen closely the functioning of the government with a lot of training, with a lot of technical support, a huge amount of money going into this training and technical support, and the outcome was business as usual. So the organizational or the informal practices of the states do not really improve with whatever resources you give on. It is not actually about the resources. It is always about the direction. It is always about what is it that you want to achieve in terms of improving the social and economic lives of the people, and how do you do that? We may need this framework. We may require some development goals, but I think that they are being set up unrealistically. Already pointed out. I think that these goals are sometimes devoid of what our societies do and how the people live in extreme poor conditions. I think we have never consulted the communities. I think we have never even talked to our communities where we work that, what is it that you want here? Are we addressing their problems in terms of access to education, in terms of health? And what do you mean by poverty here? Is it a single based measure of income inequality? Or is it expanding people's choices to growth or to access to any other social services? So we need to look at all these issues, but they are at the micro level or perhaps the meso level issues. What we need to really discuss here is how to achieve development in the first place, and by which I mean how to improve the governance of South Asia by developing a consensus that here is a governance challenge, here is the framework, and how do the organizations as we are here come together to meet this challenge of governance in South Asia. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity, and I will end my speech here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan, for putting a set of very important issues for this whole region on the table. And I think your focus on what you call the deep structures approach and your call to look at the governance issue from a non-normative perspective are two concepts I think perhaps we should try to drill down on as we go forward in the symposium. Now, the next speaker is Mr. Bhathiya Kekulanda, who is the Coordinator Climate Change Practical Action. His academic and professional training is in ecology, ecosystem services, and climate change, and he has played a lead role in shaping the work of practical action and on research on climate change. Dr. Kekulanda.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would try to provide some thoughts on why environment or environmental sustainability should be interlinked into the post-2015 development agenda. Now, you have already listened to many aspects, and especially on environmental deficit in the MDGs and the post-2015 development agenda that has been various discussions that has been happening over the last couple of years. As you know, sustainability is built up on 3 pillars, and there have been extensive discussion on social and economic aspects, and let us look at the environmental aspects and see why we need to look at environment in a much more holistic manner. Now, preliminary reflections made on the Millennium Development Goals, especially about MDG 7, highlighted the poor integration of environmental sustainability and poverty reduction. It shows that resources and efforts towards achieving poverty reduction objectives often fail to include an environmental dimension. Similarly, environmental measures operated in a silo. So the integration have been very, very poor. So let us look at how we have changed the face of our ecosystems. These are the 4 main findings of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Millennium Ecosystem Assessment assess the consequence of ecosystem change for human well-being, and it's a work of more than 1,300 experts, and which basically says over the past 50 to 60 years, we have changed the ecosystems more rapidly than any other comparable time in our human history. So it is basically to meet the needs of increasing global population, to provide food, water, timber, and etc. So this has resulted in irreversible damage to the life on this planet. These changes have benefited the human societies and contributed to enhance the human well-being and economic development for sure, but at what cost? So these changes have been grave in certain areas of the world. So some of the ecosystem changes that has happened in certain parts of the world have brought up grave concerns and to many communities. So while some have been benefited, others have been suffered. So let me quickly show you 2 slides in order to highlight some of these issues, because I can show you 50, 100 slides over the next 1.5 years, 1.5 hours, but I have taken 2 slides in order to highlight the issue. Now, if you look at this shows the extinction rates of our plants and animal species in the fossil records and the known extinctions that has happened in the last century or so, and what has been modeled for the future. So what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment basically tells us is, in the recent past, the extinction rate is 1,000 times higher than the fossil records. So then let us go for the other, and it will be more than 1,000 times in the future. See, so are we in the phase of the 6th mass extinction? Now, during the geological history of our planet, which is 4.5 billion years, we have seen 5 mass extinctions. And as per the current knowledge, we are going into a peak. And if you see, when the number of species goes into a peak, and it falls down. And the last extinction happened 65 million years ago, in terms of dinosaurs. So now, once again, we are peaking up. And if you look at all the data available in various databases, especially if you look at IUCN Red List and so on, you see the extinction rates are increasing. And for the first time in the Earth's geological history, one single species is driving a process of mass extinction. That's the difference between the previous 5 and the current one, because humans, we as a species, driving the extinction process. And the other important factor is after every mass extinction, dominant species dies off. So whether we liked it or not, right? If we don't act, we will be gone.
Is that bad?
No, I don't think so. So this is basically to highlight some of the issues, and also, so what are we going to do about this? And there have been a lot of discussions on how to look at environmental aspects in the post-2015 development agenda. And this is one particular report that have been done. There have been a lot of discussions over the world. And this report basically provides a lot of approaches and discussions and views. And I also think that this particular gathering of people from South Asia and will provide an opportunity to look at the South Asian context and how we can look into this issue. And let me finish off by sharing a thought. And this is one of my favorite writers, David O, a professor of environment and development. In 2003, he wrote an article to Journal of Conservation Biology and created a huge furor. So what he basically says, he analyzed all our environmental conservation measures over the last 50 years and says we are basically walking north on a southbound train. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bhathiya. I must say, the current and projected extinction rates and the role of human beings in this, what you call it, the 6th mass extinction cycle is more than a little sobering. So thank you very much. Encouraging for all other beings. Now, the next speaker certainly doesn't need any introduction from me. So Priyanthi is going to speak. Her presentation is going to be on ensuring that South Asia does not get left behind, addressing the needs of the poor.
Thank you very much, Indrajith. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking that actually what I'm going to talk about is really a scandal. Because actually, South Asia is not actually being left behind. If we are to believe the World Bank, South Asia is actually growing. It is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And currently only 3 out of the 8 South Asian countries are actually now classified as low-income countries. We have India, Pakistan, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka are low-middle-income countries, and the Maldives are is in the upper middle-income category. So if we are trying to address the needs of the poorest in South Asia, we can't say growth is the fact that we are not growing is an issue, or we are being left behind in the global situation is an issue. We also can see that poverty, the proportion of poor people in South Asia has decreased. even if you look at it from the $125 per day issue, or if you look at it from the $2 per day issue, it has decreased. But there are South Asia is still home to 44% of the developing world's poor, and over 1 billion people are living on less than $2 a day. So it is, the proportion may have decreased, but there are still a lot of South Asians who are not benefiting from this growth. In all the countries of the region, there appears to be a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Average earnings of the richest 10% are 8 times the income of the poorest. And if you look at statistics for some of the countries, you will see that most of the highest, the upper 20% or the command about 40% of the whole national income. So inequality, so even though the South Asian countries are not being left behind in terms of growth, inequality is a huge issue. So trickle down, the growth, the famous trickle down, or let's increase the pie before we share it kind of theory, doesn't seem to quite work in South Asia. And that's not really very surprising to me, because it doesn't seem to be working in the rest of the world either. The richest 1% in the world increased, we have been told, increased their income by 60% during 1999 to 2010. And last year, the world's richest people amassed a wealth of, I can't even figure out how much this is, US dollars 240 billion. But I can think that a lot of that would have helped address some of the issues of poor people. In South Asia, on the other hand, we have 250 million children who are undernourished. We have 30 million children who do not go to school. We have 1/3 of adult women who are anemic. So, and the list could go on. So actually, the trickle down actually doesn't happen, or somebody told me when I said this to them, it is happening, but it's not happening fast enough. So what I really want to say very quickly is who is being left out behind and excluded, and some of these statistics show us who they are. And more important, talk about a little bit, or get us to think a little bit about why they are being left behind. If you look at who is being left behind, I would say that overall there are three reasons why people are being left behind. One is that people are left behind because they are multidimensionally deprived. They're not just deprived because of income, but they are also deprived because of their social status, etc. And people who are, or because they're disabled, or because they're old, or because of where they live. So if you're likely to be having a number of these deprivations, then you're likely not to be caught by the whole development process, and you're likely not to be able to benefit from it. Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal talked this afternoon about exclusion-induced deprivation, which is about the fact that despite people who are socially excluded tend to have a lesser chance of accessing development or accessing services than people who are not. And then, of course, there's a whole geographical issue of not just countries that are poor, but also within countries, areas that are poor. And in Sri Lanka, we talk about conflict, the war-affected areas, but we also talk about areas like Badulla, which has not actually been recipient of certain development resources. But I think if you go to the question why, I think it's the issue is that we are trying to solve the problems that we create by using the same kind of thinking that we used when we created them. And I think that is a call to arms, really, that we need to think slightly differently. And if Indrajith and Debs have already talked about what we learned from the MDG experience, and there might be a good reason why we thought the MDGs need to be simple and measurable. But we all know that poverty and poor people, to think about poverty is not a simply and measurable issue. And if we confine ourselves to simple and measurable, and there's some conversation about the post-2015, how can we make it simple, because the MDGs worked because they were simple. We might get easy buy-in, and we might get easy buy-in from people, but we may not actually resolve the problems. We also know from the MDGs that the narrow focus on national and global averages hid a lot of the inequalities and the pockets of poverty that actually existed. We also know that the MDGs didn't really address inequality, and it's good to see inequality back on the agenda. But also, we need to look at overlapping inequalities, this whole thing of multidimensional depravity. We talked about this before. There was a certain politics behind the MDG genesis. But there is also, we can't forget that there are certain vested interests. There's a whole north-south vested interest. There's also interests of global capital versus local economies. And so there is a whole heap of politics that we need to actually acknowledge and deal with if you're going into the new agenda. And one of the things that has always worried me when we talk about inequalities and rights and the needing to have a rights agenda for the post-2015 is the fact that the MDGs actually sidestepped a lot of the international conventions. I think, I was there in the whole discussion leading to Beijing Platform for Action. We had CEDAW from a gender perspective. All those things somehow got slightly sidelined because we had this concentration on some very simple and measurable gender equality goals. And those are the conventions, including that, the Human Rights Convention, the conventions on socio-economic. We have the instruments that have actually highlighted and provided us a framework for dealing with inequalities, and I'm not sure we are giving that as much credence as we should. So I think we got a bit lost on the way in the MDG conversation. We achieved some things, but we got a bit lost. And I think the challenge here for us in the next 2 days and in the process that Deb's outlined for us for the future is that we need to get back on track. And in South Asia, we really need to get back on track. We need to look at sustainable development. We need to think of a development model that is replicable and lasting. I think this was a quote that comes from Dr. Gamini Korea, the late Dr. Gamini Korea, when he was Secretary General of UNCTAD, because he was saying that development needs to be replicable. And if you start replicating the current model of development, we are going to go into an infinite growth of material consumption in a finite world, which my other thinker that I have had a lot to do with, is E.F. Schumacher, said was actually an impossibility. I've talked about the scandal of inequality in South Asia, so inclusivity and equality are critical. And it's critical because we're talking about the rights of people, and people are important. But also, I think from a purely practical perspective, I think we need to recognize that equality is important. Even the IMF is beginning to recognize that growth is more sustainable if incomes are more equal. And that societies, and we know that societies are likely to be more sustainable, they're likely to be more secure, more free from conflict, if there is less inequality. And I think in this whole thing, we need to kind of begin to start thinking, revisiting the notion that free trade and economic liberalization is the only way forward. There are conversations now happening that are going back to the thinking about the commons, about sustainable and secure economies, and we need to go back to those conversations. So I think that's my challenge to you this morning and for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Priyanthi has reminded us very vividly that while some progress is being made in terms of addressing poverty in our region, there is obviously considerably a massive backlog that still needs to be addressed. Okay. Thank you very much to the speakers, really, for broadly sticking to time. We've got about, how long? 10 minutes? 15 minutes. 15 minutes for a Q&A. So the floor is open.
Maybe comments?
Yes, comments as well. Absolutely. Comments, clarifications, questions.
Which means the one who is going to ask the question will give the answer.
Please. If you'd identify yourself the first time you speak and then.
Yes, Hiroko Hama. I teach economics at the University of Shizuoka in Japan. In the last presentation, Ms. Fernando mentioned in her slide, growth is more sustainable if incomes are more equal. Is this established theory or theorem in development economics? This is my rather technical question. Thank you.
Well, it is, I don't know whether it's I'm not an economist, so it's a bit difficult for me to answer that, but whether it's in the established economics systems. But I think people are beginning to realize that growth, that there is data to show that more economies that are more equal have a more chance of growing, especially after the middle income, after you get to the middle income level. So a lot of the data that's coming out of the IFIs are actually showing that.
Sure, at the back there, please.
Can I also add to that answer?
Sure.
If you are interested in a particular study, you may want to if you want to refer to a particular study, you might want to see the work of Ravelin and Chandy. And Brookings Institution has done a lot of work on how inequality actually contributes to sustainable development and growth, actually. Because they do find that once you reach the middle income level, the more unequal the society is, the harder it is for the country to develop even economically. So you might want to check out their research. Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Please.
Andrew Scott from the Overseas Development Institute in London. It's actually quite difficult to ask any real questions because they're very comprehensive presentations. So I thought I'd maybe add just one or two points and thoughts in response to all of the presenters. First, one small addition to Dr. Bhattacharya's outlining of the different processes, which is the interesting Financing for Development panel of eminent persons, which is also due to report towards the autumn of next year. And the intention is that the conclusions of that report and the conclusions of the open working group are then combined into one negotiation process in 2015. So the intention, anyway, at least of the UN officials, is to bring all of these processes together when they start formulating the negotiating document. And I think the point is also, as Dr. Bhattacharya is pointing out, that negotiating document has yet to be written. And the open working group itself is still in the process of hearing what other people have to say and is yet to form any firm conclusions. They won't actually start writing anything by way of conclusions until about March, April, May next year. And my impression, anyway, is having had some slight engagement myself with them, is that they are very much at the moment still open-minded and still figuring out what the issues are. But also, as Dr. Bhattacharya pointed out, most of those involved in the process from the member states of the United Nations are diplomats. They're not specialists either in economics or social development or environmental sustainability. And their focus is more on the negotiation process than the actual substantive content of what they're going to be negotiating. So I think that there's still a need for a great deal of continuing input into the process. Maybe just a final comment is a question a little bit about what we want the post-2015 development agenda to be, even if it has a 15-year period to it, it's not going to deliver sustainable development. And the question is, do we want it to be delivering us onto our pathway to sustainable development, and how far along that pathway do we want to go? And secondly, the post-2015 development agenda is also going to have a limited number of goals to it. That's pretty certain. It may be one or two more than the MDGs, but it's still going to be a relatively small number of goals. And the question then becomes, what are the priorities that we want to see in that smaller set of goals, given the enormous range of issues that we've been hearing about this morning?
Mm-hmm. Please.
Hi, I'm Avnish. I teach in Management Development Institute in India in the area of public policy and governance. With the topic of the session, setting the context, what I believe is that there are two ways the presenters have seen, and I think the outside world is also seeing the same. One is to see Millennium Development Goal as Millennium Development gaps. The other perspective could be that can we see Millennium Development Goal as Millennium Development guarantees? And when we are setting the context, if we can divide between what was said by Dave as well as my friend from SDPI and the other presenters, that if we are talking about the process to achieve MDG, that is the strategy. And the second, we are talking about the product, defining the product, that what does poverty, what does education mean? Because there was a comment by Dave that talking about outcome. And I can give you a very classical example from a South Asian person who is very well known, Rabindranath Tagore. As per the definition of literate, he was never a literate person because he never went to a school, but he got a Nobel in English. So what I'm trying to say is that if the session can highlight by defining certain products, like, or take some kind of attempt to raise that issue. And secondly, what are the strategy, the processes? Because when we talk about governance, how do we define it? How do we make it simple? That is something will help.
Very much so. I think it's on. I think it's on.
I'm Anila Bandanak, retired from public service 6 years ago, so I have time to reflect. I would just like to start off from where Priyanthi ended off, this issue of the inequality. And I think what we see is there's a lot of focus on what's lacking at the lower end of the human spectrum. And I think you can't look only at that without looking at the other end, the consumption at the richest end. And unless there is, and it's not even clear to me that the consumption at the upper end necessarily makes people more contented. And still, when you look at the corporates, when you look at businesses, it's the bottom line and the responsibility to the shareholder that matters. But one cannot really make change unless there is a conviction that greater material consumption is the best thing going. Because if there is a conviction, whether it is in employment, in businesses, that whatever is earned can be distributed with higher, wages to the employees and not necessarily going back to the shareholders, how are you going to make the change? So this whole idea that, that the kind of open-ended consumption at the upper end. And in South Asia, you see it. We are talking about being left out. In South Asia, the inequalities are, I think Sri Lanka is in some senses less so, and we certainly don't have the problems of the gender issues and all that some of the other countries have. So if we set example by recognizing that excessive consumption at the upper end has to come down so that at the lower end people can have a better quality of life, there could be change. But until that is recognized, so long as there is a conviction in the human spirit that consumption is the best thing going, more material stuff, I mean, at the upper end, people are spending huge amounts to go and live in poverty, live in wild places, remote from everywhere, eating, a vegetarian diet. It's fashionable. But that's what most of the poor do in our part in South Asia. So I think we cannot only look at the lower end. The sustainability has to come by also looking at the upper end and creating some conviction that you come back, that you come to, I won't use the word regressing, progressing to the mean, which is, I think, the issue that Priyanthi spoke about. So really, I think the dialogue has to change. You have to look at both ends of the spectrum if we want to make change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we take one more comment, and then I'll ask the speakers whether they'd like to respond. Yeah.
I'm Pooja. I represent Vadana Toru Abhiyan. It's a national campaign from India. And I'm very encouraged to hear that, apart from the three main principal sort of frames, that is environmental, economic, and social, we also dealt, and it's kind of setting the tone. We looked at good governance, just governance, and we also talked about equality, justice principles, human rights principles. However, just to kind of maybe put it across and something that could be reflected, and also maybe like a question that some of you could maybe look at, is that one of the criticisms of the MDGs was that it was not really, it didn't arrive after a process of extensive consultations, or there was not much of negotiations done in that. And something that they tried to correct was through the entire process of consultations that happened in the last year, and that have kind of happened now. But what we heard after the 68th General Assembly that was just in September, got over just recently, was that now the heads of state would be kind of setting aside all the recommendations that have come in till now and look afresh. And so the high-level political forum would almost like, maybe start from scratch and take these as considerations. So does that seem as, in a sense, undoing the consultative processes that have happened, or would you see this as more of just adding on to what has already come in? So just something that...
Thank you very much. Let me just now give the speaker the chance to respond. Dr. Bhattacharya, if you would start, please.
I think the floor feedback was fantastic. I think it was very, very inspiring, because I think that we are getting to the issues. But let me first make a general point. I think you're giving me 5 minutes?
No. 5 minutes, end of session. 5 minutes to fit everybody in.
I got so encouraged. Okay.
4 people in 5 minutes.
Okay, let me take 10 seconds each on each issue. I think we can always have a general discussion on development, our national goals, our strategies, and all the deficits we have in our country. But this is not what we are discussing here. We are discussing how does our national priorities fit into a globally agreed development framework. I think it's a totally, we will wrong, because we can go on and discussing all the problems we have in our respective countries, but we will not add any value to that particular discussion in terms of having a framework, a set of goals, a limited set of goals, and some targets and some indicators in that way. Please keep that in mind. This is not a discussion about general development strategy. It is all about linking our problems to the current discourse over there. This is number one. So it's a bit different. For example, Dr. Khan mentioned about all the governance problem. I cannot agree more. That was a fantastic elaboration of all the governance problems we have. But do you want to make them the domain of international policymakers? You see, if you put human rights as an agenda in a global international framework, do you think my Prime Minister is going to agree to that? Will your Prime Minister agree to that? That the human rights situation will be assessed every other time by the global development community? I don't think it's politically feasible at all. Whether I like it or not is a different issue. But I'm talking about feasibility. And do we really want to do that or not, even within the days of globalized sovereignty? Number two. Number three, on this global the environment issue. Now, you see, Priyanthi, all those things you have said, I fully agree with you. But how do you relate it to the MDG or post-2015 framework? Look at what is happening. Relate it to the realities, because that is what is important. Look at what is happening. There are 4 areas of consensus, and somebody discussed that concrete outputs we should relate to. There are 4 areas of consensus. These things are going to be there in the whatever way in the post-2015 will be there. One is the issue of water and sanitation. One is the issue of energy. One is the issue of sustainable agriculture, along with food security, nutrition, and everything else, land use. And the fourth one is management of natural resources. These are the 4 areas of sustainable development, or the quote-unquote environmental agenda, which will be there. Are we happy with that? Do you want something else? If you are happy with that, what are the indicators you are looking for? Be concrete and be proactive and be constructive over there. Just debating how bad things are is not very useful, because we are all converted. We are all agreed on that particular issues. So let us move the debate a bit forward. But you see, I find it very surprising. You mention all these things, and somebody mentioned about that issue, thankfully, is about the consumption issue. Look at all the goals and indicators. Where is this greenhouse emission control? There is nowhere. What about sustainable consumption? It is nowhere. I don't hear any criticism from you, from this house, that telling that, yes, we are getting, that's what the point I said, you win, lose, lose. You lose the development focus and you don't gain anything in the environment, because nothing is being said on controlling the greenhouse emission, where the developed country is supposed to take on some responsibilities. You are all discussing again, national priorities, but you're talking about a universal framework, but in terms of the rights and obligations of the universal community in certain ways over there. So I think we need to move the debate. We need to move the debate. We are still very nationally oriented, but asking for a universal framework without understanding what type of indicators and goals, it really makes the balance between our national priorities and universal responsibilities in that way. There are three other issues which you could have gone. On this whole debate on growth, inequality, and how this absent, the mainstream consensus at this moment is that inconclusive. It is your choice which side of the debate you want to take to, because literature, evidence plays both ways in that way. But there is still a middle ground where we agree. Even the World Bank comes and agrees with that. It is that, and it is really difficult to have the marginal growth, marginal incremental growth, when you are becoming more unequal. So the more point is that when we talk about the inclusive growth nowadays, what are the new instruments we are bringing in on board, apart from the growth issue, whatever way we do on comparative advantage or competitive advantage? The new issue on discussion is social protection. I think this new issue on the policy issue is social protection. And Brazil has shown the way that even with the social protection, you can reach out, and that is the role of the state, and there the capacity of the state will come in again, that with public expenditure issues and macroeconomic framework, you can reach out over there. Even countries with low income can still afford a better universal coverage of social protection in different ways of addressing those kind of shortfalls, which Priyanthi is so unhappy about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bhattacharya. I mean, I think that's a very useful contribution to discipline us in terms of how we proceed. I think that's a very good framework we need to keep in mind as we go forward. Dr. Karin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, just very briefly, I would like to add is, this national consensus is also important, because we also need to see the governments approving these kind of MDGs. Because unless there is a universal agreement at that level, there should also be an agreement within the states level. So we also need to look at our issues which sort of affect on the lives, on the growth of our countries, but at the same time there has to be some kind of political commitments, because even if you make this framework agreeing all that this is what we want, these are the kind of MDGs that we want to agree to, but it comes to actually the responsibility of the state who are trying to achieve this. So there has to be some kind of political commitment, and rightly so, as you have mentioned it. It has to be something on the agenda which can be done, which can be financed, and which can be, for which we can have some kind of a consensus here. So yes, I think that we have to move towards that agenda of trying to look at, what is it that we want from this this conference here? What kind of issues do you really want to address here, and how to go about them? But we need to be mindful of the fact that there are also about the political commitments here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The other two speakers have very generously given up their time so that we can finish broadly on schedule. I'm going to be very brief in my final remarks. the presentations, the excellent presentations, as well as the discussion, have been extremely rich. But the richness of the session we've had is at the same time both encouraging and daunting. It's great that we've been able to have this very substantive and excellent exchange, but what it has brought out is that really to try to make sense of this whole agenda is going to be extremely challenging. How one, balances, how does one promote synergies across the different pillars and avoid trade-offs to capture all the kind of nuances and the complexity, at the same time end up with a measurable, and monitorable framework. Now, Priyanthi pointed out that, one can go too far in the direction of just coming out with something that you can measure and monitor, which is what perhaps happened last time. But at the same time, you do have to end up there. That's where the whole process ends up. So how we do this, if we can crack that or make some contributions towards cracking what is really a pretty tough conundrum, I think we would have achieved a lot over the next 2 days. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much to our speakers in particular, and thank you to all of you.